I came home and found my fiancée on the floor, her ex beside her, both half-dressed, white powder on the table. They looked up, like it was normal. Then I heard the police sirens. I wasn't supposed to be home that night. My business trip was planned to run through Saturday, but the conference wrapped early, and my flight got bumped to an earlier one. I didn't even tell Brooke. I wanted to surprise her, maybe grab takeout, put on a movie, and actually spend a night together for once. Things between us had been off lately. Too many late nights on her end, too many sorry, I'm tired, texts when I tried to FaceTime. I thought a quiet evening together might fix something. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was already there. The lights in the living room were dim, but music was playing. Something slow and moody, not her usual playlists. My first thought was that she was asleep with a movie running again. Then I noticed the second car parked a little too neatly behind the hedge, a black Honda I didn't recognize. My chest tightened, but I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe a friend had stopped by. Maybe her sister dropped in. Except Brooke didn't really have close friends anymore, not since we got engaged. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled sharp, like perfume and sweat, mixed with something chemical. I walked through the hallway quietly, every step on the hardwood floor echoing louder than it should have. The music came from the living room. When I turned the corner, I froze. Brooke was on the floor, half-dressed, hair tangled, eyes glassy. Next to her, slumped against the couch, was a guy, shirt off, jeans halfway down. There was a line of white powder spread across the glass coffee table. A rolled-up bill. 2 empty bottles. It took me a second to even recognize him. Chase. Her ex. The one she swore had moved out of state years ago. For a few seconds, none of us moved. Chase glanced at me like I was the one who'd barged into his house. Brooke blinked, tried to pull her shirt on, then stumbled, knocking over the bottle. I didn't say anything. I just stared at them. Everything in me went quiet. Not the kind of anger you yell with, the kind that presses down behind your ribs until you can barely breathe. Chase mumbled something under his breath and reached for the table again like he planned to keep going. Brooke tried to grab his arm, but she couldn't even sit upright. I turned around and walked out of the room before I did something that would have landed me in jail. In the kitchen, I pulled my phone out. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type. I didn't even know what I planned to do. Call her parents? Call 911. My thumb hovered over the screen when I heard the faint sound outside. Sirens. They started far away but got closer fast. I looked out the window, and red and blue flashes streaked across the street. Someone in the neighborhood must have called it in. Maybe they'd heard the music, maybe they smelled the stuff. I stepped out onto the porch just as a police cruiser rolled up. The lights made the whole street pulse. The officer in front asked if this was my house. I nodded. He told me they'd received a report of possible drug activity. I didn't have to say anything else. I just pointed inside. 2 officers went in. One of them radioed something back almost immediately. Another called for paramedics. Chase tried to bolt for the back door, but one officer caught him by the arm and shoved him down against the wall. Brooke started crying, or laughing, I couldn't tell which. Her pupils were huge. I stood by the doorway while everything unfolded. The paramedics checked her pulse, asked questions, but she couldn't form full sentences. They lifted her onto a stretcher and rolled her out while the officers cuffed Chase. He was swearing and twisting, insisting the stuff wasn't his. When they took him away, the room looked almost peaceful again. The music had stopped. The only sound was the faint hum of the fridge and the clink of a metal spoon rolling off the table. One of the officers stayed behind to take my statement. His tone was calm, professional. He asked if I knew the 2 of them, if I lived here, if I'd been involved. I told him I'd just come home from a work trip, that she was my fiancée, that I had no idea what was happening. He wrote it all down without much reaction, though I caught a flicker in his expression when he glanced at the powder. Like he'd seen this exact scene too many times. When they finally left, the house was silent again. I sat on the couch, staring at the mess. Her purse was open on the floor. Her phone was still unlocked beside it. I shouldn't have looked, I know that. But my mind was already spinning. The last messages on her screen were between her and Chase. A lot of them were old, stretching back months. Some were about meeting up. Others were worse. Mentions of money coming in soon. Of getting clean after one more run. She'd told me she was saving for the wedding, working extra hours. Turns out she'd been working on something else entirely. Further down, there were other names. Other numbers. I scrolled through until I found one labeled T. Their last conversation was just a few hours ago. It said, "He's gone till Sunday. We're fine. Bring the stuff and stay quiet." That's when it hit me. She hadn't just slipped up one night. This was planned. I put the phone down. My hands felt like they weren't attached to me anymore. The sirens were still echoing faintly in the distance, bouncing off the quiet houses. A few minutes later, a neighbor, Mrs. Keller, the older woman from across the street, came over in her robe. She asked if everything was all right. I told her it was just a misunderstanding. She looked at me with that polite concern people use when they don't want to get involved, then nodded and went back inside. When I finally turned off the lights, the house felt alien. Every shadow looked like it was holding something back. On the table, a single photo frame lay face down, the engagement picture from last fall, taken in the park. Her smile had looked real then. Maybe it even was. I couldn't sleep, so I stayed up pacing, trying to piece together what led to this. I remembered the sudden changes, the new perfume, the nights she said she was with friends I never met, the money missing from our joint account that she claimed went to vendor deposits. It all lined up now. Sometime around 4 a.m., I got a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. It was a paramedic from the hospital. Brooke was stable but sedated. They wanted me to bring her ID and insurance information. I said I'd come in the morning. My voice didn't sound like my own. Before hanging up, the paramedic hesitated and said something that kept me awake the rest of the night. They'd run a quick test on the substance found at the scene. It wasn't just cocaine, it was laced with fentanyl. One more line, and she wouldn't have survived. That detail replayed in my mind until sunrise. The woman I was supposed to marry had almost killed herself, right next to the man she swore she'd never see again, in the house we were supposed to build a life in. When the sun finally came through the blinds, everything in the room looked washed out, colorless. The ring she'd left on the coffee table caught the light, glinting faintly. For a moment, I considered picking it up. Then I didn't. Because for the first time since I met Brooke, I didn't want answers. I wanted distance. The next morning, I drove to the hospital in silence. The air felt too clean after what I'd seen the night before. Every car that passed, every reflection in a window made me tense. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, but I needed to see her, if only to understand what version of her still existed after last night. When I reached the hospital, the hallway outside her room smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. 2 officers stood by the door. One recognized me from the night before and stepped aside. Brooke was sitting up in the bed, pale, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked tired but strangely calm, like she'd already rehearsed her lines. She said she didn't know how Chase got there, that he'd shown up drunk, high, whatever he could blame it on. She claimed she panicked when he pulled the stuff out and tried to leave, but blacked out before she could. I stood there listening, arms crossed, trying to read her face. The story was full of holes. She said she didn't touch anything, but the officers had already told me her prints were all over the table, the bags, even the lighter. She said she'd been clean for years, yet the paramedic mentioned her tolerance was off the charts. It wasn't her first time. The detective, a tired-looking woman named Alvarez, joined the room midway. She thanked me for my cooperation, then asked a few standard questions. Did I know Chase? Had he contacted Brooke recently? Did I have any idea about her drug history? I told her the truth, or what I'd thought was the truth. I'd never met Chase until last night. Brooke told me he'd moved to Chicago. She said she didn't even drink. Alvarez just nodded, taking notes. Before leaving, she said something that made my stomach twist. They found a safety deposit box key in Brooke's purse, one not registered under either of our names. When I asked Brooke about it, she blinked like she didn't know what I was talking about. Then she changed the subject, saying she needed me to call her boss and tell him she was out sick. That request told me everything. She wasn't thinking about the hospital, the police, or the drugs. She was thinking about damage control. I left without saying goodbye. At home, I couldn't stop replaying what Alvarez said. I tore through Brooke's closet, drawers, desk. It felt invasive, but at that point, there was no boundary left to cross. In the back of her nightstand, I found a small velvet pouch with 3 fake IDs. Different names, same photo. There was also an envelope stuffed with cash, a few thousand at least, and a folded receipt for a hotel room rented last month under one of those names. Then I found something worse. Tucked behind the framed photo of us from our engagement dinner was a flash drive labeled Projects. It was small, black, and easy to miss, but my instincts told me it mattered. I plugged it into my laptop. Inside were video files. Dozens of them. Some were grainy and dark, others filmed in hotel rooms. At first, I thought they were personal videos, something she and Chase might have done. But then I saw faces I didn't recognize. Middle-aged men. Women in expensive clothes. The same drugs on the tables. Brooke behind the camera in several clips, laughing, giving directions. It hit me all at once. She wasn't just using. She was filming. Recording people. For what reason, I wasn't sure yet. I pulled up her email next. There was a thread with someone named Trent, probably the T from the messages last night. Their exchanges were short, coded, transactional. Mentions of drops, clients, and cuts. In one of the attachments was a blurred image of an envelope filled with cash, next to a hotel logo I recognized from the receipt. The next email had a line that made my blood run cold. He trusts me completely. Once the wedding's done, we'll have what we need. He was me. That's when I realized it wasn't about love or cheating anymore. It was business. She was building something behind my back, and I was a tool in it. That night, I got a call from Alvarez again. She said they'd questioned Chase, who claimed Brooke was the one dealing, not him. Apparently, she'd been connected to several incidents over the last year, but her record was sealed. Expunged. She'd gotten off once before. Alvarez didn't say it outright, but I could hear the implication in her voice. They were considering both of us in their investigation. I told her about the flash drive, and she asked me to bring it in. When I showed it at the station, she plugged it into her computer, scrolling through the videos without much reaction until she hit one labeled August 17th. Her posture stiffened. It was footage of a man in a suit I didn't recognize, clearly high, muttering names, political ones. Alvarez shut the screen and exhaled. She asked to keep the drive for evidence. I agreed, though I couldn't stop shaking. Whatever Brooke was involved in, it was deeper than some ex showing up for a fix. Later that night, I went through her banking app on her tablet. She'd logged in automatically. There were multiple small transfers from accounts I'd never seen. Some under fake names, others tagged with random emojis. But the pattern was clear. Every time she told me she was working late, money came in hours later. The total over 3 months? Nearly $12,000. She'd been laundering it through an old PayPal account still linked to her maiden name. While I was staring at the screen, a notification popped up. It was an email from Chase's lawyer. Apparently, Brooke had listed my name on a business registration form for something called Bright Blue Media LLC, a shell company, registered 2 months ago. My name as operations manager, her as director. I could have been dragged into her mess without ever knowing it. I called my own lawyer the next morning, a friend from college, Anthony, who specialized in cybercrime cases. He told me to lock my credit, pull all joint accounts, and keep every document. You're standing in a crime scene that used to be your life, he said. Treat it that way. I followed his advice. When I finally went to see Brooke again, 3 days later, she acted like none of it mattered. She apologized for scaring me and said she'd fix everything soon. Her voice was soft, rehearsed, and hollow. When I mentioned the flash drive, she froze for half a second, then smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. That night, I locked the front door and slept in the guest room. I could still smell the faint chemical odor in the carpet, even after cleaning. Every creak in the house made me think someone else might show up at any moment. I didn't know it yet, but the worst wasn't over. Because less than a week later, I got a call from Alvarez again. They'd found new evidence, footage from a neighbor's outdoor camera of the night of the bust. And what it showed made my skin crawl. At 8:43 p.m., almost 2 hours before I got home, Brooke had stepped outside with her phone, pacing in the driveway. Then a second car pulled up. Not Chase's Honda, another one. A man got out, handed her something, and drove away. She wasn't a victim that night. She'd been running an exchange. And I was just the idiot who showed up early. The following week blurred together. I was barely sleeping, waiting for another call from Detective Alvarez. Every morning I half expected officers to show up at my door. When the phone finally rang, her tone was different, colder, more formal. She said Brooke had changed her statement. According to her, I was the one who bought the drugs. She told them I'd pressured her into hosting clients for my supposed IT work, and that Chase was only there because I owed him money. It sounded ridiculous, but it was enough to make me a suspect. I hung up and just stood there, trying to process it. The woman I nearly proposed to had just painted me as her supplier. Anthony, my lawyer, didn't sound surprised when I told him. He said this was what desperate people did. They shifted blame to whoever was closest. Don't talk to her again, he said. Everything goes through me. But it was already too late for silence. My company's HR department called that afternoon. Someone had sent them an anonymous email with evidence of my involvement in criminal activity. Attached were photos from the night of the bust and fake financial documents linking my work account to wire transfers I'd never made. I was put on immediate leave pending investigation. I knew exactly who had done it. Brooke still had access to some of my old business files and password lists. She'd framed me the moment she realized she couldn't talk her way out. I spent that night going through every device in the house. One of her old tablets still had a WhatsApp account logged in. There, I found voice notes between her and Chase, dated before the bust. They talked about getting him off your back and using his name until this blows over. Him was clearly me. They planned this together, months in advance. I forwarded everything to Anthony. Within an hour, he was on the phone with Alvarez, demanding that the detectives review the evidence before making any move against me. 2 days later, Alvarez called again. Her voice had changed completely. She said, "Mr. Lane, I think you've just saved yourself." The police had decrypted part of Brooke's laptop. Hidden inside was a document folder labeled Witness, with detailed notes on drug transactions, names, and meeting places. Brooke wasn't just dealing. She'd been acting as a confidential informant for a narcotics unit. She was supposed to be helping them bust her supplier, Chase, but somewhere along the way, she'd relapsed and started using again. The night I came home wasn't supposed to be a party. It was supposed to be a setup. She was expecting the police to arrive, just not that soon. But the story got worse. Alvarez explained that Brooke had agreed to the sting on the condition that she remain anonymous. When the bust went wrong, she panicked and tried to redirect the fallout. Her first instinct was to make me the decoy. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Anthony told me to sit tight. He said the best revenge was letting the truth crawl out in public records, not chasing it myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Brooke wasn't finished. 3 nights later, I got proof. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Then a knock, 3 short taps. I froze. Through the peephole, I saw Chase. Eyes bloodshot, shaking, a smirk twisting across his face. He was out on bail. When I didn't open the door, he started talking, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Said Brooke told him I still had money from their operation. Said if I didn't pay up, he'd make sure my life was ruined faster than hers. Then he kicked the door once and left, laughing. The next morning, I found a folded note under the doormat. It just said, "Meet me tonight. Same cafe. Where I talk." Signed C. Anthony told me to ignore it, but I couldn't. Something inside me snapped. That evening, I called Alvarez. I told her everything and said I was going to meet him. She hesitated, then agreed to let it happen, under watch. The cafe was nearly empty when I got there. I sat in the corner, hands tied around a cup of coffee I didn't drink. Chase arrived 15 minutes late, jittery and high, sunglasses indoors. He slid into the booth, talking like we were old friends. He bragged about the money Brooke had hidden, about her cutting deals with the wrong people. He said she'd promised him a way out, but sold him instead. He started to say where the cash was stashed, but before he could finish, his eyes darted toward the window. 2 unmarked cars pulled up. Officers stepped out. Alvarez was one of them. Chase bolted toward the back door, knocking over chairs, yelling incoherently. The cops cornered him outside, where he tried to grab a metal tray like a weapon. They took him down fast. The whole scene lasted less than a minute, but the chaos felt endless. Brooke showed up not long after. She must have been tipped off, probably by one of the same people she'd been double-crossing. She saw Chase being cuffed and started shouting his name, crying, trying to run to him. The officers stopped her. Alvarez approached her calmly, told her she was under arrest again for obstruction, fraud, and evidence tampering. Brooke froze, then turned her head toward me. The look she gave me was pure hatred, not regret. Hatred, like I'd ruined something that belonged to her. They took both of them away that night. I thought it was finally over. It wasn't. The next day, I got a call from HR again. The anonymous tipster had sent them a follow-up email claiming I destroyed evidence to cover for Brooke. Even though I was cleared legally, my employer didn't want the scandal. They terminated my contract in the company's best interest. I lost my job because of her lies, even after she was behind bars. Anthony told me to file a civil claim for damages, but I didn't want to spend another year tangled in her mess. I sold the house, packed my things, and rented a small apartment across town. I tried to rebuild quietly, but the world has a way of dragging ghosts back to your door. A month after the arrests, Alvarez called again. Her tone was careful this time. She said during interrogation, Brooke had finally broken. She confessed to almost everything: drug sales, fake accounts, blackmail. But then she added something new. She'd been recording public figures during private parties and selling the footage to a man named Trent Miller. The same T from her texts. The narcotics division had been looking for him for months. Brooke's data led them right to him. It wasn't just drugs anymore. It was organized exploitation. And the kicker? One of the flash drives I'd given Alvarez was the missing piece that tied Trent to a dozen other crimes. Alvarez told me, "You did more for this case than half the unit." Still, I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt empty. The night after the call, I sat on my balcony, listening to the wind move through the trees, trying to feel something like peace. The city lights blurred in the distance. Somewhere out there, Brooke and Chase were in holding cells, plotting their next story. Maybe blaming each other this time. For once, it didn't matter. But I knew one thing. Even with them gone, the fallout wasn't done. The truth might have cleared my name, but my career, my reputation, those didn't heal as easily as wounds. And deep down, I knew this story wasn't ending with their arrest. Something else was still waiting to surface. The weeks after Brooke's arrest felt like the aftermath of a storm. Quiet but heavy, the kind of silence that doesn't mean peace. I didn't sleep much. When I did, I'd wake to sirens that weren't there. The sound burned into me since that first night. Every noise outside made me check the window, half expecting to see her standing there again, waiting for one more chance to twist things. Anthony said the district attorney was building a case. Brooke was being charged with possession, intent to distribute, fraud, and obstruction. Chase faced assault and trafficking charges, along with violating probation. They were both looking at years. But the DA wanted my testimony, too, both as a witness and a victim. I agreed, though part of me hated that word. Victim. It made me feel powerless again, like I hadn't fought back. The first court hearing took place 6 weeks later. Brooke was brought in wearing the county jumpsuit, wrists shackled. She looked smaller than I remembered, but her eyes were the same, calculated, sharp, still scanning for an angle. When she turned and saw me, there wasn't sadness or remorse. Just a faint smile, as if we shared some private joke no one else got. The prosecutor presented the evidence, the flash drives, the fake IDs, the bank records, and the hotel logs. They even showed part of one of her recorded videos, muted, cropped, just enough to confirm she was the one behind the camera. When they asked if she wanted to speak, Brooke denied everything. She said she'd been set up by the real dealers, and that I helped the police edit the footage. She kept spinning stories even while the walls were closing in. Chase, sitting 2 rows behind her, actually laughed when she said it. The courtroom felt surreal. Years of trust, intimacy, and shared life compressed into bullet points on a screen. Evidence A, evidence B, financial statement C. My engagement, my home, everything I thought we were building, just data in a case file. Anthony leaned over and whispered, "Don't react." I didn't. Not when the defense tried to drag my name into her schemes. Not when they showed photos of my house. Not even when Brooke's attorney claimed I emotionally manipulated her into a breakdown. The verdict came faster than I expected. Guilty on 4 counts. She was sentenced to 3 years, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. Chase got 5, plus mandatory rehab. When they let her out, she finally looked at me again. That same faint smile was gone. For a split second, I saw something different. Maybe fear, maybe recognition that I was no longer hers to control. Then she turned her head and walked away. After court, Alvarez met me outside. She looked exhausted but relieved. She thanked me for my cooperation and said, "You know, if you hadn't come home early that night, we'd still be chasing Trent Miller's ring. Your evidence broke it wide open." Trent was caught 2 weeks later in another state, trying to flee the country. They found more flash drives, bank accounts under shell companies, and connections to half a dozen overdoses tied to his supply chain. The press barely mentioned Brooke, but her name was in the reports, a former informant turned participant. That's how the world knew her. Not as my fiancée, not as the woman who planned a wedding in the same house she used as a crime hub. Just a headline buried under worse ones. The relief didn't come right away. I was still suspended from my job, still paying off the legal fees Anthony warned me about. My company finally cleared me of all accusations, but didn't offer my position back. They called it restructuring. Corporate language for, "We don't want your drama." So I started my own thing. A freelance IT consultancy, small but steady. Word spread through old colleagues who knew the truth, and the work picked up slowly. It wasn't much at first, but it was mine. I sold the old house a month after the verdict. The new owners didn't ask about its history, and I didn't volunteer it. Before handing over the keys, I stood in the doorway one last time. The walls were empty, but faint stains on the carpet still showed where everything had spiraled. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like shedding skin, painful, necessary. A year passed. The noise around the case died down. Chase stayed in prison. Brooke was still serving her sentence, though I stopped checking the updates after a while. Then, out of nowhere, a letter arrived. No return address. Just my name written in looping, familiar handwriting. I hesitated for hours before opening it. Inside was a single page. Brooke's handwriting again, neat and cold. She said she'd been sober for 6 months. She said she never meant to hurt me, that she wanted to fix things but got lost along the way. She ended it with a request for me to visit, so we can talk, so I can say it properly. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer without answering. There was nothing left to talk about. 2 weeks later, Anthony called. There had been a civil lawsuit against the city, filed by one of Brooke's blackmail victims, who claimed the police mishandled their informant program. My name came up in the filings as a cooperating civilian witness who'd provided crucial evidence. The case settled quietly. The plaintiff's attorney insisted on compensating me as part of the settlement, $75,000 for damages to my reputation. When the check arrived, it felt unreal. The money didn't make up for anything. It just felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence I hadn't written. I used it to buy a small cabin by a lake 2 towns over. Quiet, isolated, with more trees than neighbors. The kind of place where sirens never reached. Some nights, I'd sit outside with a cup of coffee, staring at the water, trying to convince myself that all of it had really happened. The lies, the betrayal, the investigation, the courtroom. It all felt like someone else's story that I'd accidentally walked into. But sometimes, just when the night got still enough, I'd hear faint echoes, the memory of police radios, the flash of red and blue reflected off glass. I learned something through all of it. The worst betrayals don't end when the person's gone. They end when you stop trying to understand them. The last time I saw Brooke was in a news photo months later, her parole hearing. She looked older, thinner, wearing the same expression she'd had the first night I met her, the one that made you think she knew more than she'd ever tell. She didn't get parole. I closed the article, turned off my phone, and stepped outside. The air smelled of pine and rain, clean and simple. The silence around me wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was peace. I didn't forgive her. I didn't hate her either. I just finally understood that survival sometimes means walking away without taking the final word. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming of sirens.